All right, again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Cole Schlafer. I'm a product manager here at Etactics, and I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in just a few minutes. But first off, I just, again, like to thank everyone for taking time out of your busy days to join us and gain some insight into the nuts and bolts of process writing and implementation. But after the conclusion of the webinar, we will be sending out a link to a recording of today's event, along with a copy of the slide deck to anybody who's on board. So, if you got to jump off a little bit early or something, don't worry, we will send you a link to a video of the presentation. But right now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shelly Coltnow and Dan Fisher of IntraVires Health and let them tell you a little bit about themselves. So Shelly, take it away.
Hi, Cole. Thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today. Just a little bit about my background. I'm a lawyer by training and a veteran compliance officer, and now the principal consultant for IntraVires Health Compliance. For the past 20 years or so, I've been a healthcare compliance officer for health systems, hospitals, physician groups, ACOs, and other healthcare organizations. And in that role and responsibility, I've had hands leadership and participation in policy processes and procedure planning. And I'm just happy to share some of these key steps with you today that you'll be able to use in your own policy process.
Hi, everyone. My name's Dan Fisher. It's nice to meet you again if you are in the first webinar. I am a consultant with IntraVires Health, as Shelly said, and for the past 4 years, I've been involved with developing compliance departments and their programs and conducting compliance investigations. And I've helped to build policy management systems alongside Shelly, and I'm happy to be here today again.
All right, thank you to Shelly and Dan for that insight into your background. And to tell you a little bit about myself, I started here at Etactics in 2010 and have spent most of my time as a product manager, designing and implementing software solutions aimed at helping business run more efficiently. We do that using the Connect Plus relational database platform and deliver everything from accounts receivable management to CRM software. And about 12 months ago, we saw a client software market when we were having trouble sourcing an off-the-shelf solution at a reasonable price for our needs. So we spent the intervening time really getting up to speed in the compliance space and developing a product called K2 Compliance, which is a software tool which helps manage and implement policies for compliance. And after we kind of got acquainted with Shelly and Dan in our quest to really understand the compliance world, it really brought to light their expertise, and we thought their insight would be very valuable to the community of people we serve, and asked them if they'd like to host an educational series of webinars to really share that expertise and knowledge. So we are now in the second of 3 webinars. We hope you were able to join us last time, and certainly excited that you're here today, and hope you might be able to join us for the last component. So just to recap that earlier webinar that we did, we laid the foundation for sound policy management and really focused on establishing a policy on your policies, or developing a structured and repeatable method for developing policies that featured, as you see up there on the screen now. If you didn't get a chance to join us, I really recommend that seek out the link along with the slide deck for that webinar. It's very enlightening. And if you're in touch with us, as we will be after the webinar, and would like a copy of that, we can certainly provide that for you. So today's agenda really is going to focus on what to do once you've developed that policy on policies. So really how to manage and implement policies across the organization. I'm going to take you through several kind of components within that. And for those purposes, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan and let them kind of walk you through this very detailed structure for policy management. So without further ado, Shelly, you can take us away.
Thanks, Cole. Yeah, just looking at the agenda for a minute, We think it's important to spend some time on your policy team. Last time we talked about the policy on policies, and now we're going to talk about the team that will implement it. To form that team, you'll charter, and we'll give you some guidelines to set up that charter, and also we'll give you some fundamentals for the policy manual. And then at the end, we'll go through some steps you can take right now to begin to implement your policy process. So the first thing is we want to keep the policy process on track by having a policy team. And it's important to have a team that's dedicated to developing policies because it basically reflects your commitment to the process and that the process will be reliable going forward. The team should be a manageable size. Some teams can get too large and then they can't maintain that size or effectiveness until they set up in the charter. Some key representatives of the organization should sit on the committee, and it's important to note here that they don't have to be senior leaders or managers. They can be delegates of the department that's represented. And some key that you might want to consider include human resources, finance, and in there maybe revenue cycle billing, accounting, IT, of course, people from operations such as your educators or your quality people, strategy groups such as marketing. There are a number of different organizational groups that could have representatives on the committee. We also recommend that if you do have a legal department or you have a compliance official, that they be on a member from there be on your committee. And you might want to consider those two members as not having voting rights just because they will be in a reviewing or quality control position. Another thing that your team probably needs to do right away is to choose a chair. And the chair will lead the committee on a number of responsibilities, such as making sure you meet on schedule, making sure you meet on time, preparing an agenda and circulating it along with any drafts you're going to consider ahead of the meeting, and to assure that you follow the guiding policy or the POP, the policy on policies in your charter as you operate the team. Keeping minutes, so there's a record of what the team has been doing and what it continues to do, and there's continuity from meeting to meeting. And then determining whether you need a subject matter expert, a sponsor, or another guest who can really enlighten the team about what the policy's for and what the need of it is and how they expect the policy timeline to work.
So one of the topics we're going to talk about, as Shelley just said, then the chair of the policy team is accountable to develop and follow a charter. So when a board or a top official approves a new team, the leaders of that new team should develop a charter to officially begin. A charter unifies new team members by setting goals and expectations, and it outlines the team's purpose, leadership and composition, responsibilities, and procedures for conducting business. It also states how the team will oversee the guiding policy or the policy on policies that we discussed in the last webinar. So what's in the charter? Your charter will be adapted to your specific team, but generally charters include certain standard sections, and those sections are listed here. We'll take a closer look at these sections during the next part of this presentation. And the sections here are listed in the order that they usually appear within a charter. So for instance, at the very top of the charter, the first thing stated is usually the mission and purpose of the committee or the team, its scope and authority, its leadership and membership requirements, meeting requirements such as scheduling and attendance, its voting requirements, and then its responsibilities or duties, and finally some sort of clause that requires it to assess itself periodically. So the first section is the purpose or mission of the committee. The team's purpose, primary goals, and objectives are listed here. The purpose statement describes why the organization needs the team, why the top officials authorized it, and what work the committee needs to do. We've put together a template charter, and we wanted to share the purpose from that with you. So for a policy team specifically, then we believe a purpose statement might read something like, the Policy and Procedure Committee of IntraVires Health guides the organization's process for developing, approving, and implementing policies and procedures, and it oversees the systems used by the cataloging and retaining policies. The P&P Committee supports the leaders of the organization in fulfilling their responsibility to educate on policies and promote compliance. The P&P Committee considers updates to its charter following a request by the Chief Executive or Board. So that's an example of how a purpose statement might look. Some are more narrative and others are more bulleted or shorter.
The scope and authority of the team is something that you should consider together, and it's pretty specific to your organization. There's no one size fits all here. Typically, a policy team will be authorized by your board of directors or a top leader in your organization. It's nice if you can connect it to a compliance committee or some body that is overseeing your compliance program or your compliance officer. And then it basically links back through that chain of authority to establish the organization's intent to comply and to have reliable policies that guide its operations and governance.
Now we're going to talk about membership. Earlier in the presentation, Shelley described the characteristics of a chair or a team leader, some of their duties. One additional comment that I'll make is that it's important to make sure that serves as chair has sufficient time to dedicate to the team and to their position. We find that great team leaders are flexible, organized, and people-oriented, and your chair should have some prior experience with policies in the organization, especially if they interact regularly with the top official or whoever authorized the team. Also, as Shelley just said, then a team can have a compliance official. The compliance official is a person who's representing compliance and will ensure that policies are consistent with regulatory requirements. They'll also provide updates to the committee or team about regulatory matters. And what we recommend is to consider having an outside compliance expert attend occasionally to provide insights and education to the team about compliance matters or current events in the regulatory environment, and to do just sort of spot checks on your policy system to make sure that it is compliant. Having an objective third party is never a bad idea. And then finally, you can't have a team without members. So one general conception about teams is that members need to be directors or managers. And like Shelley said, this just isn't the case most of the time. They should be chosen based upon their interest and involvement in the organization, and especially their interest in the policy process. Their appointment to the team should be approved by their supervisor because their time commitment should be formally approved so they can attend the meetings and give the due time to the policy team's mission. Finally, we talked a little bit about guests and outside experts. In addition to compliance guests, the team might invite executives, a board member, a subject matter expert, a sponsor, a peer, or a colleague who knows about procedures, such as legal, financial, or accounting principles, or maybe business process consultants to help review how committees performing or how the processes in certain procedures could be improved. We also recommend to consider if a board member could sit on the policy team or attend as a guest. When you train a board member in the organization's policies and procedures, it strengthens the connection between the people operating at the organization and the board to oversee it, and that insight into the organization really helps increase transparency.
The terms of membership are important to include in the charter. So the charter outlines the term of the chairman's term in office, especially. A tip that we'd like to share, the longer the term, the better the chair and the members understand the processes and can get it established in a reliable manner. The terms of membership also include, as Dan mentioned, how members are chosen, removed, and replaced. Occasionally someone will leave the organization or want to drop off the committee. So how's that person going to be replaced? And then the requirements for attendance. Basically, members should also disclose any conflicts of interest. And that would be if a policy under discussion or up for approval would create a personal benefit for them, then they would need to tell the organization about that. The charter should also will handle all of the conflicts of interest that are disclosed. It's probably true that there won't be very many. So just a simple process for allowing the chair to resolve those would be appropriate in some organizations. The charter can also help you decide what the requirements for meetings will be. So it's important to determine, I think we said this last time, to determine the meeting schedule in advance, because membership needs to attend these meetings. Whether they do in person or whether it's a virtual meeting is up to the organization, but attendance requirements are very important. And so the charter should really lay that out in advance, and then the chair can set up the meeting dates as far in advance as possible so that the members won't schedule over the meeting or end up in meeting conflicts or require rescheduling. The team should also decide if it wants to allow virtual meetings. Sometimes policy committee, a virtual meeting can be very efficient, especially if you're not all in the same place at the same time. So the rules for that should be laid out as well. And then the meeting procedures, when meetings are called to order, what happens if the meeting is late, et cetera, et cetera. So those types of forum schedules and requirements are critically important to the success of the meeting, and that's why they would be put in the charter.
We're going to talk about this slide for the next half an hour.
While we try to get another slide here. The next slide, if Cole, I don't know if
there we have it.
There we go. That glitch, everyone. Here are some of just some high points on these requirement schedules that you can consider getting a little more detail about. The minimum attendance. So we talked about attendance. Sometimes it's unavoidable that members will miss a meeting. This requirement will state how many meetings they can miss and still retain their membership. It's so important to have this set out in the charter so that if you do have a member who isn't really able to serve because of conflicts, you can talk to them about dropping off the committee or changing their schedule so that they can participate. You'll want to set up a convenient place and time. In the charter, you might want to simply say a convenient place and time, and then set it up in more detail through your communications process with the committee. Voting requirements are important. Some members of the committee may not be best serving the organization as voting members, such as, for example, the compliance official we talked about earlier. We really have summarized quite a bit in this next thing, processes for handling revisions. When a policy comes to the committee is really going to look at it through the lens of the guiding policy or the beyond policies. If the policy that you're looking at does meet all of those requirements, it's going to need to be revised. And so what is that going to do to the ability to approve the policy? Will you send it back to the author or sponsor? Will you take responsibility for formatting it or otherwise making it fit the POP? Or will you have another process that fits your organization approach in general? That has to be worked out at each location by each policy team. So as you're putting it together, you should be thinking about that. Also, there are policies that arrive, and the more established you are, the more likely this will be, that you get policies that are quite well done in the beginning, that you really don't have to do a lot with. They've gone back to the sponsor for any corrections, and they're ready to be approved by your committee. So those policies could be placed on what we call a consent agenda. In other words, everyone is pretty sure that those policies are going to be approved, so you can put them on without discussion. And that's a nice step for an agenda as you get established. We mentioned minutes. Each meeting should have minutes. And then Dan mentioned self-assessment. What that means is every once in a while, maybe no more time than a year should pass in between these self-assessments. The committee should really take stock of whether or not it's being effective. And if it's got some improvements to make there, and decide how those improvements are going to be implemented, and then make some goals and objectives for itself to improve using the PDCA process, Plan, Do, Check, Act, that Dan mentioned earlier.
That's great. So Shelley just went over some responsibilities of the committee, such as adopt a guiding policy or policy on policies, decide how you're going to revise policies and approve those revisions. And then another responsibility of the committee is to figure out where policies and procedures are going to be stored, which we are calling a repository or the policy manual. So at your organization, people need to be able to access policies and procedures quickly and easily. So does the policy team. It needs to access those policies and procedures readily in order for it to carry out its business effectively. So keeping policies and procedures in the same place, which we call a manual or a database, is the best way to accomplish this goal. Let's talk a little bit more about the policy manual. The policy manual, like I said, is a single location where the organization stores and organizes all of its policies and procedures and its standard operating procedures if it so wishes. The policy team ultimately decides where the policy manual is kept and how people access the policies and procedures. The policy team, it also decides how the manual is formatted. Updates that the policy team approves, they're reflected in revisions to the policy manual, and usually one member of the policy team is responsible for those changes and notifying, so for making those changes and notifying the people impacted by those updates. Usually one member of the team will go in and make the revisions to the policy manual, update a policy or a revision, and then go about communicating to those changes to everyone in the organization who's affected. So manuals can be organized in a number of ways, but your manual should be organized in a logical manner and in a way that facilitates its use and its accessibility. For example, you could divide your manual into chapters where each chapter represents a key department of the organization. For instance, human resources policies might be in Chapter 1, compliance policies in Chapter 2, et cetera, et cetera. So today we do have some do's and don'ts for you. The do's are recommendations. So we do recommend using keywords and titles to make searching for a policy easier. So be pretty straightforward with the titles of your policies. We also recommend that you do use a format that can be sorted by title, department, author, or other key characteristics. So if you're looking for all finance policies, it's simple enough to sort by the department to get to them fast. We also think enabling the printing of individual policies is good. If you're running a training session or a workshop, then bringing printed copies is helpful. And grouping policy together under the same sponsors can also do this. Linking SOPs to policies and procedures is so we recommend doing that. That way, if an SOP changes, then the underlying policy and procedure might not. Or if the policy and procedure changes, then it's good to review all the SOPs that are attached to it to see how people might behave differently in their everyday job duties or their everyday work lives to meet the new procedure. Some don'ts, we caution against using similar or duplicate titles or keywords for multiple policies. It might make searching more difficult, and it might lead to people confusing one for the other. We also don't recommend publishing a policy in more category of the manual. It's best just to choose one and organize it in that chapter or section. And we also don't recommend publishing a policy without the team's formal approval. Then follow the workflow for your policy team, follow the charter and the procedure in the charter, and make sure that, that all policies and procedures undergo that review. So creating and managing a policy manual requires upkeep. It requires a lot of attention. And often organizations turn to a technology solution to facilitate that process. So later on, Cole will explain how technology might be able to help.
So as we look at the policy process, you might wonder how folks in the organization participate. So we kind of describe the different roles at the different levels of the organization to help you sort that out. So your chief executive or your leader has the final approval authority. And of course, because they have that authority, they can also delegate that authority. The signature authority for all policies and procedures also lies with the chief executive, and you may have board policies as well, and in that case, the board chair and the board executive would have those authorities, both to create and to sign off on policies. And like the chief executive at the governance level can delegate that authority to another individual that may have a closer connection to the subject matter of the policy. Those folks who report to the chief executive, the executive team is what we're calling them here. Some people call them the C-suite, but whatever they're called, they provide an overarching opinion or institutional perspective about policies. They advise the chief executive about policies and procedures as they impact on various aspects of the organization, and they can really confirm what the policy team is recommending or challenge that if they have concerns or questions from a governance or overview perspective. In many organizations that have a senior leadership team like this, there is an opportunity for that team to review and confirm policies that have organization-wide impact. And the policy team would then be delegated to assist them in that review and approval process. The senior leadership tier would be the sponsors and authors that we've talked about throughout this presentation. If you're a senior leader of, let's say, the Human Resources Department, you might be the sponsor of the Human Resource Policy chapter in the policy manual. And each policy that's being developed or that's being considered in that chapter would really be sponsored by you and authored by you or someone you designate to author them. And that wouldn't have to be the same person every time. It would probably go, the authorship would probably go to the person who's best equipped to write the policy and understand what it's going to do and what its procedure associated with it would be like. The senior leaders also manage the risk through this policy process. So it's very important that they take an active role in their sponsorship duties. The compliance team, if you have one, or the compliance official, takes a look at policies and procedures for clarity, alignment with the organization's mission and values, and then, as Dan mentioned before, takes a look at whether or not those policies line up with applicable regulatory requirements. The compliance team may also ask for a review by a legal representative if they feel that the policy should be taken a look at from the perspective of the legal sufficiency of what's in it. In addition, we have managers, and managers are really in that tier of the organization. They assure that the infrastructure for implementing, educating, communicating, and follow-up support is in place for any new policies and procedures in their area of responsibility. And if a policy is amended or revised, the managers are sure to communicate that to everyone who's impacted by the policy. The other thing is many policies have measurements or metrics to determine the effectiveness of the policy. A manager assures that those policy metrics are monitored and documented, coordinates with the sponsors, and feeds back to the sponsors and authors any changes that they think the policy needs to have in order to be effective. Then the policy team, as we've been discussing throughout, is really working based on the requests of sponsors and authors to take a look at every policy that comes through to make sure that it fits in the policy on policies, to make sure that version control is there, to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed with the implementation dates and any other kinds of requirements before the policy gets approved and published. So to start the policy process, we mentioned sponsors a couple times. Every policy should have a sponsor, and the policy should state right on it in the template who is the sponsor by title and who is responsible for authoring the policy by title. The policy team is essentially delegated from the guiding policy or the POP to determine the sponsors. And really the best way, I think in the first webinar we mentioned that you should consult an organization chart to look at who the leaders are within your organization and who might be a chapter sponsor for each of the chapters you've established in your manual. The sponsors are responsible for the subject matter and accuracy of the policy that has been submitted. And then the members of the policy team really have to rely on those sponsors and authors for that, while they are the owners of making sure that the policy fits all the guidelines in the guiding policy and is structured so that, as Dan mentioned, it's easy to find, appears in the correct chapter of the policy manual, and has the correct version always in front of the organization. And this there are some policies that almost every organization, regardless of how big or small it is, should have. So we thought we'd go over some of those with you today. First of all, I think most of us in healthcare know that we have to have policies that reflect our organization's handling of private protected health information and for keeping that information secure. So we're recommending that as a category of policies that we think you should have that reflect the requirements within HIPAA, high-tech, and other applicable rules about maintaining privacy, what to do in the occasion of a breach, how to maintain a log of all disclosures, and other types of policies that really bring your privacy program together. The second group of policies pertain to fraud, waste, and abuse. In healthcare, we worry all the time about fraud, waste, and abuse because our government stakeholders and payers do not want to pay for activity that is fraudulent, wasteful, or abusive. And so what we want to do is define what fraud is, what waste is, what abuse is. We want to talk about how to prevent, mitigate, and correct fraud, waste, and abuse. And we want to have a process for addressing it when we find it. So once we define it, we're going to say how we address concerns about it. And perhaps in that group of policies, we're going to talk about overpayments and how we handle those and what we do when we have discovered overpayments, when we have to look back, when we don't, that kind of thing. And then communication to the provider, if that's appropriate for your organization, so that they can recognize that there's been an event and then to prevent and correct going forward. The next group is whistleblower protections. Here, we want to make sure we have an outlet for reporting concerns in good faith. It's important to establish that all reports of concerns in good faith are accepted and investigated. And then the next group is we want to make sure that we don't officially or unofficially retaliate against anyone for bringing forth a concern about misconduct in good faith. So that policy on no retaliation would be a sibling or a sister policy to the whistleblower protection policy. We mentioned conflict of interest before, and I don't think we need to say more about it other than a policy that you might want to put in place would describe what it is, would say what you would do about it, and would have a system for managing conflicts of interest, as well as asking folks to disclose voluntarily if they have any conflicts of interest with the organization. Records management policies, I'm sure many of you have these. It's information management, record management. Here, we really want to have an official way to manage the life cycle of your organizational records. We want to say what kind of record it is. So we want to identify or classify the record. We want to describe how we're going to store it, how that's going to be secured, how we retrieve, track, and use records, who has access to records, and then how do we manage old records? Do we destroy them? What records need to be kept forever? A relative term, I guess, forever, but what records need to be maintained regardless? And then essentially, what records do you need for purposes of patient care? And how is that security process going to be maintained? So those are some of the types of policies you'd have there. The next group is a compliance program policy set, and we have covered the 7 elements of a compliance program before. So those elements really need policies to bring them to life and have them implemented in your compliance program. But for purposes of just highlighting some, I think how you investigate fraud, waste, and abuse under the compliance program, how corrective action plans are developed, how you educate and train folks about compliance or as part of a corrective action, and then maybe some sanction screening or background screening to make sure that everyone you're interacting with is not excluded from the Medicare or Medicaid programs, which is an important aspect if you're dealing with those programs. Finance policies, we talked a little bit about last time, just to say briefly that there are probably a lot of those policies that really need to be in your manual. Things that essentially talk about how your ledger and journal entries are made, how you make payments, how you receive income, how you close at the end of every month, how you balance, all those kinds of accounting policies, and then your revenue side, like these would be included maybe in that section. And the same with human resources. They're pretty standard, but we would consider policies like wage and hour types of policies, time, attendance, tardiness, payroll, vacations, benefits, those kinds of things would fit into that part of the policy manual. And then, although it's not on the slide, information systems and information technology section might be added. And there we would want to talk about a number of different things, including how you would incorporate and use new technologies, basically who has access to all of the information you need to operate your systems, help desk policies, that kind of thing. So I think that's a basic type of policy group that you would want to have no matter what. And then, of course, there's probably many policies that you would add that are probably exclusive to your organization or to the type of business that you're running that you would want to add to those.
Thanks, Shelley. So one of the last topics we'll talk about is implementing policies and procedures. We've discussed how policies should be framed in the guiding policy and how the policy team handles them. And now we're going to take a couple of minutes to discuss a process for distributing policies once they're approved, then training on them and monitoring for adherence and performance to them. So here are some steps for implementation. Like Cole said at the beginning of our presentation, auditors and regulators really ask two questions when they look at your policy management system. The first one is, do you have them? And then the second one is, do you follow them? So here are some steps that your managers and policy team members can take after you approve a policy to ensure that people in your organization are aware of the changes and know how to adapt to those changes. We think that starting by creating a template piece of communication to inform people in your organization that a new updated policy is ready is very important. A standard email or letter, whatever is more effective for your organization, just to let people know that there are certain updates. And you could even list those updates on that letter in just a bulleted form. And then schedule some workshops or training sessions about the new policies and procedures. Maybe you do that in huddles or weekly team meetings, practice manager meetings, but some sort of workshop or training session so that people are aware of what's been done and how to handle the new changes. And with that, if you're on the policy team, right after you release some new policies, make yourself available for questions. You'll get more questions right after you release a new policy. And so it's great to have answers ready for that and be willing to engage in that discussion. We also think that there should be some sort of assessment process. Go ahead and plan that, to plan on conducting an assessment every once in a while. We said quarterly here, but it's really however often is appropriate for your organization. And the assessment would ensure that people understand the policies and adhere to them. Sending reminder emails after you release a new policy is a great way to follow up. And when you find that people aren't adhering to the policies, then the policy team can use a performance improvement technique like a Plan, Do, Check, Act, or a PDCA to improve the distribution and trading process and enhance policy performance. So these are really to drive home that second point, to make sure that your policy process is sustainable, that people are aware of changes and know how to handle them, that trainings happen on a regular basis, that you know how to assess their performance, and that there's a way to improve the performance if you find some deficiencies. So this process is really complex. We did it on one slide, but it really takes a lot of work. It can be tricky, and if anyone on the webinar wants to discuss it in more depth, then by all means, feel free to contact Shelley or me at IntraVires Health offline, and we're happy to have that conversation. So now I'll pass it to Cole. One thing we mentioned earlier was implementing a technology solution for your policy repository or database. And I think he's going to talk a little bit more about that for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan and Shelley, for the great walkthrough on how to put together that policy library and maintain it over time, along with a little bit of information on implementation. And I'd like to briefly just touch on how this program can really be enhanced through the use of technology. So to start with the simple, you can call off the search for existing and sometimes outdated policies. Hopefully the days of paper copies and filing cabinets are really coming to an end. And part of establishing a really sound policy management program is using the tools and resources of a compliance software tool as well to ensure that you're following all those great steps that Shelley and Dan outlined. Technology such as our K2 compliance solution really can allow organizations to digitize their policy library that you've worked so hard to create so that they're easy to find and access. Ownership of each one of the policies can be assigned to the appropriate policy committee leaders, and then a history and versioning of those policies can be tracked within the system, allowing you to go back and say, well, what was the active policy on such and such a date? Finally, a new channel of communication is then established between members of the policy committee that allows them to collaborate in a single workspace between meetings, and then also the policy committee and the rest of the organization. that allows for those new policies, updates, other notifications to be pushed out, and for a real process to be put around that part of the policy implementation that Dan just laid out for you, that communication piece, communicating new policies, updates to existing policies and procedures. So once you've established those policies, and really the challenge of implementing them and all their associated procedures begins. And technology can really help implement and document those procedural efforts across the company, because having great policies is in and of itself a very good thing and a positive thing. Like Dan mentioned, that's the first question a regulator is going to ask. But if you can't prove they're being carried out throughout the organization, then they really aren't going to do you any good when those regulators work. So taking policies and putting them into an interactive and dynamic format, like what we've done in K2 compliance, can allow the organization to document those ongoing efforts against all the appropriate components of their policies or procedures, and provide the necessary evidence to support that case when the regulators knock on the door. Additionally, incorporating technology into your policy management efforts can really provide you with the ability to map your policies to the various regulatory frameworks, like a HIPAA, like a PCI, like a NIST, and really show you where there might be some gaps in your policy library and where you need a policy to address a particular part of one of those regulatory frameworks that you are held to as an organization. So just to kind of wrap up then, these are just a few ways that software technology can enhance your policy management efforts. And using available resources like a software tool is really just the tip of the iceberg, or in our case, pyramid, when we're talking about best practices to implement policy procedures. And that concept of the pyramid certainly brings us to our next part of the webinar series, which we'll be conducting next month, which is making the best of your policy management practices. That kind of wraps up the educational part of today's webinar. And we'd definitely like to open the floor for any questions that might have come in, either during the course of the webinar, or if you want to type any of those in now. I think there's a question tool within GoToWebinar. So kind of hang for a moment and wait for any questions to come in.
And if anyone thinks
sorry, go ahead, Dean.
Oh no, that's fine. If anyone thinks of questions after the fact, they're more than welcome to contact us.
Yeah, absolutely. Either the IntraVires team or Etactics would be happy to even direct you to the right place. And we'll also be providing an email after the webinar where you can provide some feedback to us, as well as I think we'll have a link to a video of today's presentation, along with possibly a copy of the slide deck, for you to peruse at your leisure or share with members of your team. And again, anybody that has any questions, feel free to type them in. If I don't see any in the next few seconds here, we'll probably just wind down the presentation. So again, if anybody wants more information, either about the K2 compliance software solution that I mentioned, or the consulting services provided by IntraVires Health, and Dan and Shelly and the team over there, please don't hesitate. Reach out either via phone or email, or by reply to the email that you'll receive from the Etactics marketing team. There's all kinds of ways to get in touch. So thank you again for attending. And again, everybody should be receiving a copy of the webinar today. And we really hope that we can see you all next month again as we conclude the final of our 3-part webinar series. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Cole. Bye.
Bye now.